about such a new technology they have, and then used to say, why do you bother me? I'm so busy. So one of my experience of developing SupTech is about AI chatbot. We FS got a lot of consumer complaints. We have already created algorithm and system last March this year in order to deal with consumer complaints. But the system intelligence is still the level of children. We need to educate the AI system. In other words, questions and answer data for various situations should be transplanted. However, artificial intelligence remains in its early stage as incumbent officials are too busy to do their own original works. So I think making a consensus within organization is basic to activate SupTech at the actual development stage. There are similar situations in RegTech as CEO and executives of financial institutions perceive RegTech as an investment, not cost. Yeah. And then let me introduce our plan to SupTech and RegTech project. We plan to complete 3 RegTech projects and 3 SupTech projects for fetching up the pump until end of this year. Summer already started. In order to activate RegTech and SupTech in your country, I think it's very important to make prototype and sample something operable for market participant. Because if market stakeholder can understand the regulator stance, they don't move. So in RegTech and SupTech, regulators should move faster. Regulators have to patch the pump. So in RegTech, we are developing prevent system to prohibit violation of foreign exchange utilization law. And secondly, we already set up RegTech financial security system. And next year, we will concentrate on effort on developing machine-readable regulation, codable regulation or machine-readable rules or the same meaning. But it is test version. In SupTech, we've already developed anti-voice phishing app and anti-smishing AI algorithm. It's very interesting for you. Next year, we will finish proof of concept of AI-based pilot system to review the term and condition of financial instrument. The financial instruments belong to asset management companies' private equity fund. Because why I mentioned that you probably interested in the AI-based the anti voice phishing scam, because I think RegTech and SupTech can be also used to maximize the financial inclusion, because financial fraud usually used to target on low-income people who have very poor financial literacy. I think the spread of fintech could further increase financial fraud. For example, when transferring money become easier and easier, and when more people can access to the financial service, financial crime like voice phishing also increase. It's Korea experience also. I think it's a dark side of financial inclusion. So AI app is available for customer for 3 months ago in Korea, and offering real-time voice analysis that detect voice scammers commonly use. But still app is only available on Android platform. When you get a phone call from scammer, the telephone begin to vibration, and then the change of the screen color is green to yellow or red. So it is very intelligent service, because we have a lot of victims' data, and we put together into this system. I think supervisory authority need to consider how to prevent side effect of financial inclusion by using the SupTech.
Yeah, I think some really good points there, and I think one of the biggest ones is that along with this explosion in digital and finance, we're also seeing an explosion in financial crime. Biggest growth area in sort of financial crime is from the standpoint of digital. I wanted to ask one big question. You mentioned cost. How expensive are you finding the projects? Is it something that you're finding it very, very expensive or not so expensive? More in time or more in technology?
At this time, we developed machine learning regulation is just a proof of concept. So we will focus on just a small part of the financial law. For example, the regulation for reporting or the structure. So I think in the stage of the proof of concept, we don't have any answer for the cost-benefit analysis. But when we made this something operable and system, and we will upload to the API system. So financial institution can connect this system, and then they may understand what is the machine learning regulation. So after that, we will gather the all financial institution, and we also gather the opinion about the machine learning regulation. So I think after that, we will decide whether we to develop machine learning regulation for financial institution, and at that time we will do the more detailed analysis for the MR. I think, yeah.
I think two really interesting points there. The first is the necessity of engaging with the industry when you're thinking about these projects. And the second is really something that we have an increasing range of regulators have cost-benefit requirements. And so how can you go through these analyses? I have some more questions, but I'm going to basically say, please feel free, anyone at this point, to begin moving up to these chairs to join the conversation. I will say, if after my next question no one has moved to these chairs, we're going to move to the front row. At which point everyone in the front row will be as part of the conversation. It won't require you moving, but we'll move. But in the first instance, maybe just encourage anyone who wants to join at this point. I have a question that I wanted to go back to that I mentioned earlier, and that is from the standpoint of central banks and financial regulators digitizing their own systems, and starting really with Joanne and Peter. What are you seeing from the standpoint of working with authorities who are perhaps starting in paper-based or analog structures? What sort of strategy, what sort of plan, what sort of senior involvement do you really need to make this work?
I think if you're starting out in this journey, I think like most things, the tone from the top has to be right. So, I would often say to people, if people are happy with Excel and are happy that's fine. If that's the level that you want to get to, maybe that's okay. But I think what people often forget about is the maintainability, the future-proofing of systems that they're doing. And I think it does need a vision and some buy-in from the top that, why is data important? Why is it important that we get this data in? It can't just be for the sake of it. I mean, I think there's some bad examples out there of regulators asking for a lot of data and then not using it. So you can see then that you get a lot of maybe pushback in the industry or things like that, where it could actually be counterproductive for a regulator to start suddenly going, okay, I used to collect this paper-based form and now suddenly I want all this granular data. If you can't use it and if you're not going to use it, then why do that? So I think there does need to be buy-in at the top and a vision for where you want to get to, and what you're going to use this data for. Is it going to inform policy? If you're looking at AI, for example, and text mining, is that because you're going to inform policy and make some changes? Or if you're looking at just moving from a paper application form to something, is that because you're going to reduce the authorization time and licensing time for, say, a new financial industry participant from 5 weeks down to 5 days? So, definitely buy-in from very, very senior management in the regulator. And I would say, we talk about cost benefit, but some metrics as well about what is this digitization going to actually do? Not just, we obviously start with POCs, and that's really important, but moving to the next phase of investing in this, you've got to have metrics on what it's actually going to do or what you think it's going to achieve.
I think that's really important. So basically, buy-in at the top and a strategy of why you're doing things. And I think in some of the more successful examples we've seen, that's exactly the combination which has been in place. I just say on the side that it's something that at the G20 and Financial Stability Board level, post-crisis, you've had what is called BCBS 239. It's a sort of data aggregation rule, which basically means that financial institutions have to collect all sorts of data at the sort of global aggregated basis. And a sort of joint project between the IMF and the FSB looking at data gaps has meant that increasingly, particularly from the macro-prudential standpoint, the fund in particular is looking at its own analyses and saying, wait, we're discovering that we need this particular type of data to figure out whether this sort of macro-prudential approach makes sense. And so I think at a global level, this is something to be aware of. I was wondering, Peter, from the standpoint before I open up, from the standpoint of ADB and from the standpoint of research functions, if you were thinking about digitization of data collection across governments and central banks in your member countries, what sorts of things would make your life easier in terms of collecting the sorts of data that you need?
Thanks, Douglas. Great question. Let me share one experience relating to this question and also a bit echoing Joanne's points from my previous job. So before I joined ADB, I was with the European Central Bank, and I joined it 2013. So we speak a little bit about the European sovereign debt crisis. And I joined a department which was not very well known of being a very, data-driven department, which was the Market Infrastructure and Payments Directorate. So basically, we had access to transaction-level data of Target 2, which is the European-level RTGS system. Transaction by transaction, we speak about 300,000 transactions per day. We speak about 2,000 billion of turnover in euro per day. And that used to be a rather boring unit before I think I joined, but then suddenly everybody was so interested in the data, and we were supporting any business area in the bank with various sets of analysis, which are, I guess, up to today sometimes confidential, but of course you can think about money market fragmentation, issues relating to financial stability, up to even policy strategy to monetary policy. And yeah, once people realize in the bank, like other directorates, that it's really, really useful data, this big data, to be analyzed, I think that was a big buy-in from the top. And then we were able to recruit, we were able to get more resources. So I think in this case, the crisis happens, and then people realize that it is super important. And what I know from my former colleagues, that today they use machine learning, they use AI. So now to your question for ADB, of course, yes, we do also engage in research in the research department, and we really like to engage further next year in fintech-related research. Actually, a bit broader even. We will have a theme chapter next year of our Asian economic integration report on digital platforms, so investigating not only fintech platforms, but also a bit broader sense. And we really want to pinpoint a lot of issues and inform policymakers, also relating to data, regulation, and supervision. And I'm very much looking forward to engaging further in this research. Yeah.
Sounds good. And before I invite our new member to join in, I want to come back at some point to talk about this idea of, if you are an authority, how do you go about designing your own data systems? And that's a question that I'll come back to in just a minute. But first, welcome, Malik. If you would, just say who you are, and then question, discussion, comment is open.
Hello? Yeah, it does. Thank you. So hi, my name is Malik, and I am the co-founder and chairman of Innovation Labs. And I spent most of my career before fintech in banking. So I'm one of the, as I said in the morning session, probably one of the only few in the room who's a non-regulator or a non-policy side person. So I'll also share my perspectives from the other side, someone who used to, if I may say, supply data to the regulators. And I had some observations because I actually led a couple of these big data regulatory reporting projects across 42 countries. So my first question, and perhaps Joanne, you could, if you don't mind, take that. Consistently, all four of you alluded, and probably the one word which stood out maybe 100x more than any other word here was data, and data cleanliness or data alignment. We all intuitively understand how much of a significant challenge it is, and I've been on the other side, so I know the pain. But my question is, and Mr. Kim, like you are a regulator, I was looking at pain from just a single entity perspective. Even within that, the data, forget modeling, even the labeling was so fragmented. And then when you multiply it by the entire ecosystem of banks, et cetera, I can only well imagine the challenge of a regulator. But since you work with so many of them and you are a leading solutions provider, could you give maybe one example that stood out for you, which was really an application of the tech part of the RegTech and the SupTech story that helped you to solve this particular problem, and whether it was, creating a DMP platform, or whether it was, and I know many regulators, you spoke about APIs, BSP has opened APIs here, et cetera, but all that comes in secondary. The first step is garbage in, garbage out. So how do you even, or not even garbage, how do you even align garbage? So the first question is, is there one live example that you think you can share with us which we can really learn from? And then I have a second question, but if you may.
Sure. Well, I think if you talk about data standards, first of all, there's definitely many examples where we've seen standardized data models being applied. There's XBRL as now XBRL is a format, but there's a lot of European standards that have been applied to data. So we have in Europe, for example, in insurance, we've got Solvency II, which is a single standardized data model for all insurers for reporting. Would I say that's a good example or not? I guess there's an issue there with the cost of that across the industry. So what it did mean was every regulator in Europe could look at a particular, a particular standard and apply it consistently, and therefore at a European level, analysis could be done on that data. But I get.
Raw data, or was it aggregated data?
There was a mixture of some. I wouldn't say. I guess when we're talking about granular and raw data, so there's maybe different levels, right, of granularity. So there was aggregated. There was also some granular type data in Solvency II, but. I think where I wouldn't say that project, where that had an issue maybe was that the data standard was applied globally or across Europe, and then each country, each financial institution, everybody came up with their own solution to how they were going to do that. So the cost then was massive across Europe. And I guess a different example that I've seen, maybe not on the regular side, but on the tax side, the OECD have a common reporting standard, right? So the OECD define a single XML schema. Now, this isn't huge volumes of data, but they defined a single XML schema across the world. This is the common reporting standard. They have a global transmission system, so data can be shared across borders, and that was done, relatively quickly and applied across many, many countries. So. And that was not I would say not such a burden on people to apply. Obviously the tax authorities still had to make some changes to systems, but what happened there is the OECD, or this sort of standard setter, if you like, provided some of the technology required. So they provided this common transmission system, they provided very clear standards, and I think that's where I see standardization. We talk about, tone from the top within a particular regulator, but if you want to have you talked about payments, for example, if you want to have cross-border data sharing, then you do need some global standard setters to be defining what that data is. And it should take some input from industry as well, because one of the challenges with banks is why does the regulator define this like this? We don't define it like that. And it can be very frustrating, but obviously a regulator, supervisory authority, they've got to try and come up with some standard for their country. For example, they have to be able to analyse across, the entire industry. So I would say probably that OECD example to me is probably a good example where data, first of all, had to be collected and shared, and then it's reciprocally shared across jurisdictions, and now people are looking at how we're going to analyse and use that data for tax purposes. So that's a good example. And I think just systems need to be system design is very important, but data design and data standardization is probably the first step, as you say.
I thought Dong-Tae made a really good point on this earlier, that when you're thinking about these things, it's very useful to have the regulators step in at an early stage, because if you don't coordinate, you end up with the risk that every provider is providing data in a different sort of format, and then when you go to the point of trying to apply analytics to that, it doesn't work. And you can think of at the global level the really bad experiences we've had in the context of OTC derivatives, where the data are just not comparable across different jurisdictions, and the end result is that it hasn't worked very well. Or one can think of dating back to the Asian financial crisis. One thing that came out of the Asian financial crisis was the IMF's General Data Dissemination Standard, which is all about standardizing data on reserves and a range of other issues that previously, if you're trying to collect these, you didn't have. Dong-Tae, anything you want to add? Or?
You mentioned the standardization of the data, so I'd like to say that from the standpoint of industry of RegTech and SupTech, I think it's very important for the supervisory agency move first, because if they make some prototype is operable system, probably the market will be understand what happened next. So I think naturally, I think from the nature of the RegTech and SupTech, I think the responsibility is very heavy on the supervision by the regulator. Yeah. They have to move first. Yeah.
Welcome. Hi. Yeah, it works after a second usually.
Hello? Yeah, there you go. Hi, I'm Lisette Cipriano. I work here in ADB. I'm the organizer. I'm the lead organizer here for the forum. Good to meet you all. So let's just maybe take a step back. Now I understand the value of RegTech and SupTech. How do I even begin to implement, and how do I choose the right partner?
I mean, maybe, Dong-Tae, a quick answer. How did you all go about figuring out who to work with and what initiatives to take?
How does one start?
In my experience, it's very difficult to induce from the developing, the IT company. It's very difficult to select the IT company, and it's very difficult to the budget and invest money on the system. So probably all of the central bank and regulator have same considering and same problem. But in Korea, we gather the major banks and then major security company, and we explain the how to move next stage in RegTech and SupTech. So they voluntarily money, they invest money on the system. So that's I think the key practical point here.
Quick answer?
Where do you start? I think I think there's a lot of initiatives out there with GFIN and AFIN, the APEX platform. There's lots of initiatives out there which are looking at trying to maybe share the experiences of multiple regulators, because one thing, we talk about collaboration within a country, for example, within the ecosystem within a particular country. But I think having more platforms where regulators can share what they've done, and the infrastructure there as well, where maybe people can quickly prototype things. So if you imagine if every regulator had to go and maybe purchase hardware, or if they had to go and maybe get, spin up their own cloud environment just to try something out, that's a very expensive way of doing it. So I can see if there are global platforms, global networks that can be leveraged, that would be a good way to do it. And I think there's a lot of resources out there. And I do think what I'm seeing definitely is there's, we talk about what are the global trends. I think there is this trend towards collaboration a lot more. And people are much more open to sharing information, to sharing best practice, what they've done, what worked, what didn't work. And because, we work in 30 countries, we're a small firm based in Ireland, but the only way you can really collaborate like that is using technology as well, right? Using these shared platforms. And I think that's probably sort of the next stage we need to go to is trying to have a good definition or a good understanding of what good looks like, because that's difficult for banks as well. They don't want to end up with 25, 30 different RegTech providers in 5 years' time. So trying to maybe, I think there will be sort of a consolidation a little bit, but sharing of best practice is probably a good way to go.
I think that's a very good point from the standpoint of thinking about the international organizations. As I'm finding myself participating in more and more sessions like this, sharing